I was just gonna wear a shirt you guys did, and I was like, now I gotta go. I was like,
Okay, go ahead and take out your Zen. How do you spell cord? Yeah, there we go. Sorry, I have to do an email. I love doing stuff online. There's boxes for grabs. I know. I just got a big email that said boxes for grabs. I know, it's exciting, isn't it? Awesome. Oh, awesome. Okay, so do we got the Zen assignment? Don't look into the light. Now all I see is a big kind of blue dot for everybody. The projector light. It's a little warm in here, isn't it?
Yeah, a little. That's irony, finally.
Irony. So I do now, I think the classes are going to be pretty set, so I have seating charts. Well, I mean, I printed one, so. Any questions on the Zen? They're good questions. We're going to talk about a few of them today, but I want you to read through that, especially number 7. And did I screw this up? Somebody made a mistake. Okay, if there's no questions, did anybody else have their notes? They didn't turn them in. I think everyone got those in yesterday. Okay, Mark's just going to give me the Zen questions. I'll go around. We have some people didn't get them done. What's that? No, it's too small for you. Let's see if don't have it? We cover your nose up, and at least you have no gain, huh?
yeah, I'll wake up with pain in the weight room today. No game. I'm guaranteed.
Come. Very good. Do you have it? I can't find it. Ah, okay. Very good. Now I said I will give you a little bit of a grace period during the hybrid time, but I'm not going to knock you down. So you have to get that in. Oh, so now the classes are pretty much set. I have the maps graded. I'll grade the notes and I'll get those back to you then as soon as possible. I just didn't want to record until I knew exactly who's going to be in class because I had a couple of people in fourth period move. Just switch classes and I don't want to worry about it right now. Okay, next. I'm not gonna send any more of that packet in Zen. Remember what I told you? I printed it because I was basically thinking, well, I had no idea what the beginning of the school year was going to be like. So I just printed it out so I had all 3 just in case. but for time reasons, we're not going to do that. But we are now broadcasting on YouTube, and let me make sure this is working. It says I should open up a widget. Okay, so tomorrow and Friday, you're not going to be here, but I'm still going to broadcast. You'll be on YouTube, so you can watch it anytime, or you can watch it with class, or with the class. It doesn't matter. I'm just going to film it at this period. So you'll be accountable for the material in here. And I am going to make a little bit of a reading assignment for chapter 3. And I just arbitrarily put it down for Friday, but for you, that basically means Monday. Make sense? I just hate this, but I'm just going to put an arbitrary date. I got to change my mask. I was hoping I'd make this mask work. It's so much more comfortable than the paper mask. But I could just feel my nose popping out like on every other word. So, no one breathe. I do have a mouth. Okay. Is any teacher using a microphone when they try to use this? Do you have anyone doing that? I was going down the hall because I'd study all second period, and I could hear someone like a microphone blaring down the hall. Oh, yeah, I bet that was it. Because I'm not sure. I couldn't see it. I'm loud enough, so I don't need this. Okay, so I'm going to sign chapter 3. It's a very short chapter. The book does something really weird. Chapter 3 is really short, and then chapter 4 is like the longest chapter in the book. Instead of just combining them in America. Is that what you're asking? So, only 3.
I'm sorry.
I am smiling under here. I understand. So, chapter 3 is really short. And I just made a list of terms. Okay, before I gave you that outline, since I'm not going to do that for this one, but I still want to give you a list of terms, of things you need to know. And I will give a quiz. My plan is, and we'll do the quiz really quick on Monday. Even though technically it's due Friday, because I just but there's a few terms, and I'm going to ask about 5 or 6 questions. It's going to be really a basic quiz. But the terms for chapter 3, those will be answers to the questions. You get them all. See? Playing about the books. Sorry about that.
I have 2 of them.
You have 2? You won the lottery. Did I just give you another one? I'm still. So I'll just ask very basic questions about this. The reading quizzes are going to be very simple, very basic ones, and I still have not decided if I'm going to do it, just give you a quick quiz in class, or do it on Teams. I don't really want to do it on Teams, but since there are about 5 students in here that are DLI, I might have to do that. If we do it on Teams, I'll let you know. It won't be a big deal. It'll literally be like 5 or 6 questions. And for this one in class, if I decide to do it in class, I will let you use anything you jot down for notes from the chapter. A little bit later on, that will go away, but for the first ones, we're all trying to get used back into the swing of things. You know, heck, it was 6 months ago that we were kicked out. I always forget how long ago it was, and that the spring was just kind of this surreal land. It was not, didn't really feel like school. This kind of does, but still off. So I'm sorry about that. All right, so we got to finish up where we left off. Now that people are watching, let's go ahead then and take your notes out. Did we get through? Did we get through tobacco?
Yes.
We got some plantation.
Oh, good, plantations. Right here. So we got John Rolfe. Who did John Rolfe marry? Pocahontas. What tribe? Yeah, the Powhatans. And did we mention, I mentioned them, right?
Yes.
What was it, the company? The company, the joint stock company.
Virginia
Yeah,
something.
Virginia Company of London.
Yeah.
Let me do something really quick. Why is this up? Sorry, I'm having computer issues. It's always good. I can blame the computer for everything. This time it really is computer issues, but sometimes it might not be, but I'm still going to blame the computer. You'll understand. I'm sure you've done it. Okay. So, do we talk about leaching the soil? Oh, okay. So tobacco cultivation, the way they would do it, so did I mention how American Indians planted everything together in one field? I didn't talk about that. They planted everything together in one field. And so there'd be beans or maize or potatoes all in one field. It takes longer to cultivate, but that means the soil's always being refreshed with nutrients, especially from the, that's what beans and peas do. They regenerate the soil. European style, the kind that now happens here for the most part, all one crop. And tobacco really sucked up the nutrients in the soil. In about 3 years of intensive agriculture, they would plant as much as they could pack in. And basically, no fertilizer at all. 3 years the soil would be leached out. No nutrients left. So it could grow almost nothing. Maybe beans, but beans aren't going to make a lot of money. They need tobacco. And so the planet, boom, soil used up, and they need more land. And where's the land? In the West. So these are the first plantations. And here's Rolfe, Mary, Pocahontas. First plantations. And they're right along the James River. But quickly they're going to move more and more west. And as they move west, they're going to bump into the tribes. The Powhatans allied with them, but that is going to lead to a series of wars, the biggest being in 1618 and 1619, the Powhatan Wars. So we don't need to know the exact date, just need to know that this happened. And this happened all on the frontier. So this is going to happen in the Carolinas in the early 1700s. It's going to happen in Massachusetts in the 1630s, 40s, 50s, all the way. So this is just one example. And think about the Powhatans. Devastated by disease, they were farmers. Hard to farm when you don't have very many people. As they begin to break down, they did something that was anathema to them. They formed a confederacy with their enemies. They formed this confederacy and did a series of surprise attacks. So this area here was with the Powhatan and their allies, even though they were enemies just years before, and would become enemies again. They attacked all over Jamestown colony, Virginia colony, all on the river, and there are a few spots here with their plantations. And this is a very stylized painting of it, but as you can see that they were attacked. I hope this is working. I have a better microphone coming, but I got to use this thing. Surprise attack. And here they are. They made it very stylized, massacring them, killing them in cold blood. But yeah, these are brutal attacks. This was terror. They want to force the colonists to leave. Excuse me. Well, with that, Powhatans won. By all measurement, they won. And Jamestown agreed to pull back to just around the James River. And they had essentially a peace conference. The Powhatans won essentially a peace conference. And in it, a commodity that was already becoming a big thing to trade for fur. The Virginians pulled out wine and gave wine to the Powhatans. Does anybody want to guess what was special about that wine? They poisoned the wine. So they killed most of the leading warriors. Now, for American Indian tribes, women made most of the big decisions, did most of the work, but men had two roles, hunt and fight. And so they killed the best fighters off with poison. So who won? Virginia. That's how they won. They learned very, very quickly the Puritans would do the same thing in Massachusetts. So I just gave you one example. Then we'll get to King Philip's War, where they did it just slightly different. And this would become the norm. This would become the norm. The United States did it too, many times against various tribes. Not only using poison wine, but a lot of times just getting them drunk and having them sign over everything. That's coming down the road. But that's an example. So there's going to be constant war. So there's just one example down along the frontier. And so the tribes here are going to fight back. They're going to fight back. Now, every year, they get more and more outnumbered and pressed up against the mountains. Please switch. So these are the Chesapeake colonies that were developed. Virginia and a little bit later Maryland, to a lesser degree Delaware. So Delaware would be a slave state. It stayed in the Union, but it was a slave state all the way up to the Civil War. And they prospered because of tobacco, but still, the company was in debt. They wouldn't make money. Eventually, the king would just take it over. And they had land. Now, this gives all, this is Chesapeake colony. I'm just talking about just a couple areas here for land. They have land. But to those who came there and started to run the plantations, the tiny percentage of people who were elite, they needed workers. And by the way, that should tell you what they thought about most people, which is the way that, the elite think of most people to this day, that they're workers for them. We need somebody that we can make money off of to do our work. Why do you think there are jobs? Most jobs, you're hired because they believe they can make money off of you. That's the reality of it. We'll talk more about how that happens. I should add, our economy today is totally different than what they have then. We couldn't have made it then, and they wouldn't have made it now. We'd roll up into a ball and cry if we dropped back then. Also, it'd be a shock. So with that, here is Virginia colony, and so I have a little allergy here. And this is a great map of Virginia. This is from 1630. They had very accurate maps. When you think about it, they had to be good map makers. They had to be. And they would go through every inch and chart it and draw it. Some of their maps are just incredible. I'm always impressed by their maps. One thing that happened about this, though, the colonies are kind of left alone. Even when they became a royal colony under the king, they created the House of Burgesses. And this was the first colonial legislature. As they would have called it, a parliament. And it was the first one, 1619, kind of a big year. And because the king was so far away, they would appoint a royal governor by the end of the decade because the company would eventually go broke. But the Burgesses could do taxes and some laws that only applied to the colonies. But do not think of this in terms of all people eligible to vote, all people old enough to vote, they pick their representatives. No. This was a tiny group of elite. Who were the elite? The planters, a.k.a. Burgesses. That's what Burgesses means, the planters. And they would get together and pick one of their own to represent them in, at first, Jamestown, then Williamsburg, and then eventually Richmond. This is in Williamsburg, Virginia. And if you ever get a chance to go there, it is really cool. It's like going into a time warp. They have it set up where it's like 1730 all the time. And everybody who lives there, they act like it's 1730. And you can go and try to trick them, to try to get them to say something modern, and they're good. I tried. It was fun, actually. It's really a neat place. Jamestown is cool, Yorktown, it's just they do a great job there. And here's one of the settlements of the Burgesses, and think about it. They're the elite. They're the planters. And they basically only have two goals. Why they're there for the legislature. They're not there because we want good government and to have the best for the people. No, what two things do they want? Money, and land goes together with money. That's really good. Yeah, and power, to stay on top. That's what they want. That's a lot different than politics today. That's me joking. Yeah, the people who make the laws almost always make the laws for the people, for them and people like them. It's very noticeable today. Very noticeable. That's why, for example, in the 1930s and 40s, Franklin Roosevelt was such a shock. In fact, wealthy people called him a traitor to his class because he was one of the few that actually worked with some Republicans, mostly Democrats, to pass laws. Didn't all work 100%, but for regular working people. It was so shocking because that never happens now. Maybe it will someday. But with that, we'll get to that era. So the House of Burgesses, so they're making laws. So here they are moving westward. There's war, there's labor shortages. They always want land. They're obsessed with land because the soil leaches out so fast. But labor is everything. Labor is a thing that you get these southern plantations, that's all they'll think about. We need a constant source of labor. And here are pickers. They need people they can force to work. And by the way, tobacco cultivation, back-breaking, horrible work. What is the average temperature in Virginia in the summer? 1,000,000 degrees. Okay, that's a slight hyperbole. And what's the humidity? Not here. Has anyone ever been into 103% humidity? That's beyond the saturation point. It can do that.
Probably.
Huh?
If it's 100% of the water.
Yeah, it's literally, the water just bubbles on. And the air feels heavy. That's Virginia a lot of the time. Tobacco likes it. And the rest of the South. So, here is, okay, this is a copy so we can read it. But this was an advertisement from the London Company. So, the basic words are right, but writing at that time we wouldn't have been able to read. And you see what it is? Settlers for Virginia. You get land, ship fare. All you got to do is work. Meaning, what are they advertising for? What do we call those people who agreed to be a slave? Yes, indentured servants. So in Britain, there are all these desperate British. They've been kicked off their farms. It was called the enclosure movement. We don't have time to go through the British history, but think about people absolutely desperate, wandering, taking whatever work they had. They were citizens of Britain. They were Christians, even though they're going right through their religious wars. By the way, if you wonder why we have a separation of church and state, because our founding fathers knew a state based upon religion might lead to the horrible religious wars that were happening 100 years before the U.S. became a country. We'll talk more about that. So, desperate British, absolutely desperate. And so they would have ads like this. Wanted. This one's very specific to Virginia under indenture for a few years. And they want somebody skilled in Greek and math. I was just trying to figure out why you want somebody on a plantation who knows Greek, but why not? I guess that's to imply they have a classical education. Almost all the indentured say they'll be a slave, completely owned by the other person for 7 years. 7 years. In fact, here is visas in England. So this just arrived in Virginia. They have servants. So if they sign a contract with one person, that person can sell the contract to somebody else. So these servants can bounce around all over the place. So they're a slave. The vast majority of African slaves who were captured in Africa, and I imagine you did too, you probably know a little bit about this, have this image of Africans being captured by slave hunting parties or through war. The majority were probably debtors who are working off their debts as something like indentured servants. And the next thing you know, they're sold off and going across the sea and they're kidnapped and so on. Which makes it even more scary, I think. But 7 years a slave. So they get passage over, and then what do they get? They'll be free. And they'll get, and this is important, a headright. A headright might involve a number of things. Like maybe a cow or seeds, but the big thing, 50 acres of land. 50 acres of land. So to somebody who has nothing, 50 acres is everything. So you're going to go through hell, where somebody owns and can do literally anything they want to you. Literally. But you got a contract. Here's a contract of indenture. This is from 1766. So that you'll be cared for 7 years. Cared, meaning you'll be a slave. That's a piece of paper. That's a big deal. Remember those people I told you about in Africa? They didn't have that piece of paper. They weren't citizens. That is huge. So, why do it? You know, why would they do it? This map shows the areas that are diagonal line here. Huge numbers of indentured servants escaping war, escaping the ravages of it's called the English Civil War and the religious strife. But the thing is, only reason I put down how bad it was, it must have been hell for most people. It must have been hell on earth for most people. You think how bad life would have to be right now for you, at your age, because you're the prime age, to give up everything and be a slave for 7 years. To be beaten and owned and controlled and sold and anything you can imagine, they would do. So people were desperate. This was not like, oh, let's go have fun. But it also shows how my life is horrible, but maybe there I could get something. And the way they looked at it is the word they would have used in 1650 was liberty. Okay, liberty is a little bit more than freedom. But liberty is that I can make my own decisions. No one can tell me what to do. And to somebody in 1650, it was land ownership. You own that little piece of land, you're free. You're free. If you don't own land, how are you going to make a living? What do we call that today? If you don't own your own business, or you inherited a lot of money, what do you have to do? Work. For whom? The man. Very good. You have to get a job, get a wage. And to the point of view of colonial America and early United States, that means you're a slave. By the way, we all think, oh yeah, I'll get a job now. That attitude had to be literally beaten out of people in the 1840s and 1850s. And it worked. We now all accept we'll work for somebody else and get a wage. That's going to fall quite as much. So, one more thing. They all said, this might be hell, but it meant you all have these certain rights as an Englishman. And they would talk about this over and over again. I have rights as an Englishman, and no one can take those away. In the events leading up to the Revolutionary War, they weren't talking about rights as an American. All the way until independence was declared, it was rights as Englishmen. No, they can't list these rights. They're undefined in many ways. For example, right now, all of you probably think, well, I have rights. Can you really list those rights? I mean, a couple, and you'd probably be wrong on half of them. I'm not giving you a bad time, it's just the way it is. I mean, can you name one right you have now as an American citizen of the United States?
The United States or the world?
Just the U.S. Can you think of a right you have?
Freedom of speech.
You don't have those. Nowhere does it say you have those. See, we all think we do. I know, isn't that horrible? All it says is Congress can't abridge the freedom of speech. It doesn't say you have freedom of speech.
I get it.
You know what we call that? A loophole. You're not wrong, but it's more complex. Yeah.
Don't we have the right to own a gun, but we're not 18 yet, so.
No, that's not the Constitution.
Oh.
Right to bear arms.
We'll talk about it. No. No. No, you don't. If you had the right to bear arms, you'd have a thermonuclear bomb in your basement. You don't have that right. Arms are military weapons. So, and that's, do one of you have a thermonuclear bomb in your basement? Yeah. I'll be the first and last to know. I go, okay, so with that. So eventually almost 200,000 people came as indentured servants. And at that time, that's pretty significant. And think about 200,000 people crossing the Atlantic on sailing boats. Little sailing boats with about 50 people. You know, think how long that would have been, and how many would die when they got there. Because when they got there, the first 6 months were the most horrific. In fact, they had a name for it. The name is actually kind of creepy if you think about it. It's called seasoning. Okay, when I always thought it was kind of funny the first time I read that. And then I think about, what do you season? Something you chew up and eat, right? And swallow. Meaning, what's going to happen to these people?
Getting seasoned.
Yeah, literally. Chewed up. Oh, not quite. But after 7 years, you know, they're going to be kind of used up people. I mean, they made it, but it's going to be really hard. Gives you an idea how bad it, once again, how bad it was. There are a lot of diseases that ravaged them, but the one that killed them, literally, was malaria. Now, malaria was not in the Americas. Malaria first came from England. Malaria used to ravage southern England. So, what carries malaria? Swamp gas. No, that's what mosquitoes. And not all mosquitoes. It's usually mosquitoes in pretty warm climates. Of course, with climate change, that's getting further and further north. Yes. Quinine. Okay, that's why you drink tonic water. Yeah, it has quinine in it. And that will at least alleviate some of the effects of malaria. Now, there's actually two forms of malaria we'll get to in just a second, but malaria, okay, if it ravaged southern England, some people had antibiotics to it. But still, you can become very ill. When you catch it, the fever can get as high as 108, 109. And to a lot of people, they go into shock. But even if they don't die from that hell, can they do anything? I mean, they're just going to be in misery. And people might be sick for months, aka 6. And the worst part about malaria, you could feel good one day and go, feel good for a month, feel good for a year, and then it comes back for the rest of your life. So malaria has not ravaged the United States, even though there's some strains of it back in Florida since the 19th century. Doesn't mean it won't. But if you go someplace with the malaria, take everything. There's a couple vaccines you can get and mosquito netting. But that's good advice. Don't get malaria. There's another disease that came from Africa called yellow fever you might have heard of. That's even more nightmarish. But malaria is the one that spread the easiest. But there's actually 2 strains. Another strain came, it's called Plasmodium falciparum. I just wrote it down to remember it. And these areas is where the mosquitoes that could carry it are. They still are. They're just not as many now. This one came from sub-Saharan Africa, meaning it came on what? Now, here's the thing. The one that came from Africa that would ravage this whole area, Europeans had no antibiotics for it. Now, Africans would still get incredibly sick, but they had some resistance. Does that make sense? So what's going to happen to the indentured servants? They're just going to get devastated. Just devastated. If you ever go to South Carolina, we've been to South Carolina. Yeah? Charleston? And it's got all that mansion area. Well, that's where the planters lived. Because where all the plantations were with rice, indigo, and other things was swampy. They couldn't go because of the mosquitoes. And so they needed someone to go work for them who's less susceptible. to those who run the colonies, who do they want their laborers from? More and more from where? There's a reason to get from Africa. Malaria. So you read about, and that's one thing I liked about Zim. It talked about why Africans would be enslaved, why it's so difficult for them, or why Europeans wanted it, but they don't mention the malaria. So there seems to be this feeling they work better. Oh, they resist the one strain, but those are American Indians killed by malaria. They would be devastated. Another disease brought over from the Eastern Hemisphere. So, 1619, same time, same year as House of Burgesses. The first African slaves were brought to Jamestown. Now, some might have been brought as early as 1617, but that one's still shaky. We know for sure 1619. Now, there have been an African slave trade from sub-Saharan Africa for thousands of years. Heck, there was a slave trade all through the Mediterranean. But when the Portuguese were going around Africa, when they got to this area here, it was much easier for them, for the slave traders, to trade. There's not really there's not very good port cities here. So roll them offshore, roll slaves offshore, and sell them to the Portuguese. They begin to sell them here, and then in Cuba and Hispaniola. Now, there was already slaves here. They were enslaving, oh heck, there'd be slave expeditions for the Ottomans would go into France or Spain and enslave people. Spanish would go into the Balkans or Egypt and enslave people. Huge East African slave trade. You get the point, there's all kinds of slaves. All kinds of slaves. But New Spain really demanded slaves for the sugar plantations. So a lot of money would be made, and British and Dutch traders got rich doing it. British and Dutch shipping. The Netherlands was a new country, but a seafaring nation, trading country. We get a lot of what we are from the Dutch. Everything from how we use our currency to things called corporations. This is a very stylized picture of the first African slaves. It's not very accurate, but it's a picture. They didn't have good cameras. But not only African slaves, there were American Indian slaves, which we talked about before. There were also slaves that came from all over Europe and Eastern Europeans, and then indentured servants. You get to the point, there's all these people that were technically slaves. It was really confusing in 1650. They need labor, and they're just sucking in people as fast as they can to work them to death on these plantations. But they're all members, including the African slaves, of the lower class. By the way, are there more lower class or more elite? Yeah, about 99 to 1. The elite have got to figure out ways to stay on top. And these are the lower classes that are being exploited. Now, slavery is not free, but it's a way to get people to do a job they don't want to do. Most people would not volunteer to go work on a tobacco plantation. And I want to be very clear, slavery had nothing to do with skin color. Nothing. They were enslaving white people, they were enslaving darker skinned people, lighter skin, it didn't matter. And skin color didn't matter. It just, that was it. Technically, they would only enslave heathens, people who were not the same religion. But tell me, if you're going to enslave somebody, and you're Christian, how would you know that other person isn't a Christian? Yeah. And if they said they were a Christian, what would you say?
These people just said no.
No, you're not a Christian. You're enslaved. But I am a Christian. No, you're a slave. What did the Muslims do? The Sunni Muslims, when they enslaved people in France, they wouldn't enslave other Muslims. So what would they say? No. If you convert, too late. This will actually become a problem down the road, but they'll come up with a solution, those in power. So with that, and one more really important thing. Most slaves were more like indentured servants. Slavery was not permanent. even in the New World, slaves after a certain time would be given their freedom. The children of slaves were not slaves yet. They were treated more like indentured servants. In fact, smell bar ready? Oh no, we got time. Finish this up. In fact, we're not right down that. Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. So, you got a paper towel. They'd be given a head right. And this is the thing they would do on plantations. Say you're a slave. And they would say, okay, nobody wants to be a slave. And once they live there for a while, this might shock you, slaves don't like slaves. Now, me saying that, you're going, duh. That'd be one of the big arguments for slaves. Slaves really like it. They feel like a purpose in life. But, you work for 5 years. 5 years as a slave, and I'll give you your freedom. You could run away and risk it. If you're captured, you might be tortured. 5 years. Can you do 5 years?
Sure.
Sure. How's that different than indentured servants? They don't have a what? They don't have a contract.
So
That's
after
the
those
deal.
5 years, they can basically be like, cite my mind.
Or they could make a law and change the whole thing. That's why I had you read that fornication law. That was written for a very specific reason. It wasn't just like, oh, let's just make this. No, there's something big going to happen. And what is it? We're jumping right here. Oh, we already mentioned these. These are things I already said, so I don't need to go over this again, the distance, and right? Unless you want me to. Let me get to this real quick. Bacon's Rebellion. Bacon's Rebellion. That would be one of the most important events in American history. It really is one of the 2 or 3 most important events in our history. What happened in 1776, by the way? Something happened, yeah.
It's
Yeah. Yeah, the Declaration of Independence. U.S. declared independence. Interesting, that's 100 years apart. So, they're always moving westward. There's war all the time. Everyone understand that, right? There's war. They're fighting to keep their land. And I would argue it's very justifiable, but to the colonist point of view, they didn't see it that way. It's important to understand they had different points of view. But remember the head rights? What land were the former indentured servants getting? And some of them were African slaves, former slaves. Not just African, they could be all kinds of. What kind of land? Say it again. The 2 different types. One would be Indian land on the frontier, and the other that used up land. Think how mad they would be. They worked 7 years. They're beaten, and if you could guess what's happening in the fornication law, raped. And then they get land that they can't grow anything. On that happy note, when will I see you again? So I will film this tomorrow, all right? Hey, it's weird, I know, we'll get through it. And that's the great thing about the YouTube one. You can watch it anytime you want. You're accountable for it. Have a great 5 days. Let's see you.
So, you want us watching the stream tomorrow then?
Yeah.
Too?
So tomorrow I'm just going to do it just like for bees,
Okay. Alrighty.
Huh?
Those terms are due on Monday?
Yeah, but no, you're not turning anything in, I'll just have a quiz over those terms.
Okay.
Sound good? We'll see you.
Yo,
All right, I gotta shut off the stream.
Yo, they decided to cast out all the vegans.